Welcome back to Looking at History. My name is Nick Raposo. This is part 3 of Andrew Choong's amazing presentation on the HMS Cressy.
So here we are at the forward end of the ship, and you can see two of the ship's three large anchors, and they're stored in a very interesting way. Now, one of the other innovations that was built into Cressy is this particular method of anchor stowage, because before then, on the large battleships and cruisers, traditionally the Royal Navy used to just run a bit of the chain across the bow, and there'd be an indentation at the forecastle level, and they would be stored that away. Now, this was all right, but it was quite inefficient because it meant you lost a bit of deck space, which was quite important. And also the method involved in catting the anchors and bringing them round and securing them was somewhat more labor intensive. This way, you could just bring them up, and it was a simple matter to just use a derrick or something similar to house them straight into these huge cast steel holders for them. What that meant was you not only had a complete forecastle's worth of deck space, it also meant there was nothing bothering the gun when it was traversing, but it meant that they were stored in a place where they weren't really interfering with any shipboard operations, and they were no more vulnerable than they would be in any other circumstances, because the old system was just as exposed to enemy shell fire as that was. So lots of benefit, no real change. Again, we can see the steam mechanisms for operating the capstans. You could bring the anchor up by hand, and some cruel captains did make their men do this because apparently it was good for them, bit of exercise. But generally speaking, in this era, that technology had enabled this to become a much simpler job. Now, I've been trying very hard not to talk about the elephant in the room, which is the glorious 9.2-inch forward gun in the turret here. This was a very effective weapon, and the turret designed for the ship, maybe more properly a gun house, because it wasn't that well armored. You can see the density of the front plate, which is very thick, but it is thinner at the rear and very thin at the top. Now, that was fairly standard for this period because most battles were expected to be fought at close range and at fairly flat trajectories. So that makes sense. The turret of the ship is mounted high up, and on a very high hull like the Cressy's had. This is great because you can fight your guns in heavy weather. You have a glorious field of fire. You've got good command. The only problem is, for the aforementioned safety reasons, you can't have your magazines too close to the gun. They have to be below the waterline where they'll be safe from enemy fire, below the armored deck. And that's why you have to have this incredibly complicated trunking system so you can get your ammunition, your shells, and your powder cartridges from point A to point B. And the way they get around this by way of labor-saving devices is equally clever. That it's a hydraulically operated system, but it can also be operated manually. So if anything goes wrong, if the hydraulics suffer damage in battle, you've got enough men available, then you can get on those hand cranks and you can keep those shells coming. I want to draw your attention to that door at the rear face of the turret, because to give you an example of just how cramped these areas could be relative to the number of men inside them, we're talking about 10 to 15 when she's at action stations. When you loaded this gun, you would put in your shell and you would put in the powder charges, and they would have to be manually rammed. Now, rammers were so long that you'd have to have that rear door open so that the end of the rammer had room to come out while you were loading the charges. Just remember not to engage enemies on both sides at the same time, because you might have problems. But yeah, that just shows what a space-efficient design it was. The turntable was very clever because not only did you have the hydraulically supported mechanism for turning the turret, there also was a row of shell stowage spaces built in and around it. So rather than waiting for fresh shells to come all the way up from the magazine, you can see the trunk for the hoist mechanism going down there. You actually had about 40 rounds worth of ready-use ammunition ready to go within the gun house itself. And that gave you a bit of redundancy, because never mind the speed of being able to reload and fire, if something happened to interrupt that flow and that system, you still had a decent amount of shots to hand ready to go. But yes, as you can see, the traditional method of arranging ammunition supply and the gun itself. This was a very tried and tested layout by the time Cressy was designed. And the idea was, because as with any powder charges, there's an awful lot there that can go bang. So here we have a very fine view of the ship's propulsive machinery. You can see the end of the boiler room here. And boiler room spaces in a warship of this period are very easy to judge. You just have to look at the number of funnels and the space they occupy, and you know all that trunking is going to be going down into a boiler space one way or another. It's a good way of gauging just how much of the ship is taken up with this. But right after the boilers, of course, we then have the main propulsive machinery spaces. So what we're looking at here is a profile view of one of the ship's two triple expansion engines. Now, those of you who know your engines might go, wait a minute, triple expansion, but I see 4 cylinders. And you'd be absolutely right. One of the peculiarities of design in this period was that 2 cylinders were the same size on the more efficient engines, meaning that you effectively had a 4-cylinder triple expansion engine. It made sense to somebody. But the upshot of it was that this was a very efficient piece of equipment, but it had horrendous maintenance issues, especially if you ran it at high speed. A particular feature of any kind of expansion engine of this nature is that you have lots and lots of moving parts, and because they are steam driven and they move at high speed, they tend to get very hot. And this meant that you'd frequently suffer from breakdowns when you were going at maximum speed. You'd have to have hoses playing almost constantly on some of the engine components in order to keep them cool. And this would then mean that you produce extra steam, which makes it a bit of a hellhole to work in an already very hot place. And the noise of these things would have been indescribable. I have met people who've complained about the noise that modern marine turbines make. If they wanted an exercise in relativity, they should have gone back in time and worked in an engine room on one of these. You would be deafened after a few hours of sustained steaming. Now, I can't talk about the machinery spaces on a ship without talking about the plight of the poor stokers, because this was arguably the worst job in the Navy. Your sole task was just to be in there, either in and around the boilers, or even worse, if you're really unlucky, within the coal bunkers themselves, making sure that the coal was getting to the hungry boilers. And it was messy, it was dirty, it was hot. Ventilation down there was absolutely appalling. There were large fans, which were a benefit, but their primary purpose was not just to benefit the humans who were slaving away in the boiler rooms. It was to produce draft to keep the boiler fires at an efficient level, or forced draft, as the Navy used to call it. And so you'd be working in what was probably a very literal interpretation of Dante's Inferno. But you also had to keep sharp, because this was not a mindless shoveling job either. You had to know your job very well. You had to gauge how much coal a fire would need. If you overfed it, there was always risk of a bit of blowback if the fire got enthusiastic. And of course, the stokehold grates were mostly open, so you had to watch yourself there. Even the poor guys inside the coal bunkers had to watch themselves, because there was an art to this, and it was called trimming. Because if you simply started at one end and started shoveling the coal towards the aperture that led into the main boiler room, you'd create problems for yourself. One, if you took too much from one side and ignored the rest, you'd lay yourself open to the risk of an avalanche of coal coming down on you, which you did not want. The other problem was the ship's stability. The coal bunkers were so large and so capacious in these ships that you had to make sure you went through the coal supply in them at an even rate, hence the trimming. Because if you did something weird, like taking too much from one side, it could adversely affect the ship's stability. So you had to keep your wits about you. Even if you've been shoveling coal for the better part of 3 or 4 hours and you're absolutely exhausted, you do have to keep an eye on what you're doing, and you have to retain at least a local awareness of what's happening around you, because never mind the important stuff about keeping the boilers happy and trimming, you also didn't want to get involved in a nasty industrial accident where you get buried under tons of your own coal. That was not an ideal outcome.